Chapter 11 The Red Inquisition. Anastasia followed the priestess through the market and rushed into the inn, where Gilbert and Rosie were arguing about something with 3 guards. As she entered, one of the guards noticed her and gestured the other 2 to accompany him to the necromancer. They were clearly still a bit unsure about how to deal with her. "Miss Necromancer," the guard that had noticed her asked, "could you lower your weapons?" Anastasia looked down at the new daggers in her hands and quickly put them away. They were sheathed, but it was generally frowned upon to be holding a weapon while talking to a guard. Yeah, sorry about that. Is there a problem?" she asked, fearing that the whole ordeal with the paladin wasn't over after all. The guard took out a rolled-up map and spread it on the table next to them. It depicted the northern side of Valor and the areas immediately around it. Multiple spots all over the fields right outside the gate had been circled. There have been some sightings of skeletons here. They started appearing yesterday and have since moved a bit closer. Every time we try to approach one, it dismantles itself before any contact is made. Since you are the only necromancer in the city, we hope you might be behind it." Anastasia shook her head. "No, I don't do that," she muttered worriedly. "Are you sure? It's not against the law or anything, nor are they harming anyone." The guard explained and gauged the necromancer's reaction to make sure she wasn't lying, while the other 2 guards moved to block the door, just in case he tried to flee for some reason. "Very well, then the guild would like to ask you for help in solving the matter. In all likelihood, you are the leading expert on the undead we have. I'll check it out. For now, you probably don't want to keep the gate open too much." Anastasia agreed and stared at the map. She didn't like how the circled areas were all in the direction of Morn Valley. "Thank you, Miss Necromancer. We apologize for the trouble, but please make sure to deal with the situation with haste," the guard said, bowed slightly and hurried out with his colleagues, presumably to close the gate. Anastasia kept staring at the map and racking her brains to figure out any alternative reason for the skeletons, besides her family. Gilbert had already figured out what she was worried about and patted her on the back. "Think it's your folks?" he asked. Anastasia sighed. "Someone from Morn Valley for sure. The fields around here aren't suitable for natural undead to pop up. If I had to guess, it's someone from the team they used to hunt down rogue necromancers and other troublesome people." She explained and tried to remember who exactly it could be. The so-called Red Inquisition consisted of 7 members: Amaranth, Coquelicot, Alizarin, Carmine, Ceres, Crimson and Auburn. All of them had their own strengths and techniques, and all of them were easily competent enough to match Anastasia's power with skill, if not straight up wipe the floor with her. As she was about to leave, Gilbert blocked her way out. "You're not going there alone," he said and grabbed the necromancer by the shoulders. Yes, I am." Anastasia sighed and pushed his hands away. "Some of the people it could be are capable of using living matter. You people are nothing but fodder if you come with me." The old adventurer grudgingly let her go and started to nervously look for his pipe. "Where's that stupid plant girl when you need her?" he muttered, remembering his conversation with Anastasia about necromancy not working on Spriggans. Anastasia passed through the gate just as it was about to be shut. She told the guards to ready some bows and shoot at anyone suspicious looking, and headed to the area where most of the undead had been sighted. The sun was already on its way down, but thanks to the lack of wind, it was still a bit warm for her liking. Though compared to the high likelihood of getting caught or killed, it really didn't bother Anastasia too much. She had left her daggers behind, but that wasn't really a problem, since the bone in them would have been just as usable for whoever was after her, and the mass grave under the fields would provide ample weaponry for any number of necromancers. Just as the city gate disappeared into the distance, Anastasia could see a figure in red robes, sitting on a large rock by the road. She hesitantly walked over. "Good evening, Anastasia." The Inquisitor greeted her and stood up. Anastasia recognized him. "Fuck off, Auburn." Auburn was the Inquisition's newest member and luckily the least experienced among them as well. 3 years older than Anastasia and of noble birth, he was a regular visitor in the castle Anastasia had been held in, and the 2 were somewhat aware of each other, even before he joined the Inquisition. Pale, blonde and somewhat skinny, Auburn was what one could consider to be an average-looking necromancer. But what was not average about him was the reason he was allowed to wear the sanguine robes of the Inquisition. While not too strong overall, given enough time, he could reanimate and control countless numbers of undead creatures. Unfortunately, under their feet was exactly that, countless skeletons. You know why I'm here. Either you come home willingly, or I'll take you there in a bag, the Inquisitor stated coldly. Anastasia squeezed her hands into fists. I'm not going, she snarled. Hearing that, Auburn grinned. Good, I've been waiting for a challenge. He laughed and lifted his arms. Suddenly the ground under them shook and dozens of skeletons dug themselves up from the soil. In seconds, that number increased to hundreds of undead soldiers that crawled, stumbled and limped towards Anastasia, wearing armors from countries that hadn't existed for a good while. While it would have been possible for her to take control of a few, there was no way to match the Inquisitor's numbers. There was too much distance between the two for a direct attack as well, and Anastasia was forced to flee. Barely able to scatter the bones from a handful of skeletons and open up a path, she made a run for it. While running away gave Anastasia some time to think, every skeleton she passed soon joined the growing army following her. Trying to match it with an army of her own was beyond pointless, as reviving things was far from being Anastasia's forte, and the army quickly grew beyond the point where simply fighting it was possible. The only real solution was to find a way to directly attack Auburn himself, but the Inquisitor was in the middle of his thralls, and any projectile thrown at him would be stopped before it even got close. Come on, think of something, anything, she agonized while dashing through the fields. Eventually the distance between the necromancers increased enough for her to be able to stop briefly to catch her breath. Evening, Anna. Having a bit of a jog, she suddenly heard from behind her back. Familiar greeted her and smiled. The Spriggan had been on a walk overnight and just happened to run into her on the way back to the city. Evil necromancer, bajillions of skeletons, Anastasia managed to say while gasping for air. Familiar peered into the distance and was barely able to make out the incoming army of undead warriors. Oh wow, that's a lot of them. Need a hand? She asked. Anastasia wasn't able to answer, so instead she just huffed at the Spriggan angrily. All right, I'll give you some time to come up with something, Familiar said and gave the necromancer a thumbs up before Anastasia ran off again. The Spriggan's slight green hue became more intense, and the small plants around her started to grow quickly, as her roots dug into the ground and spread everywhere. New flowers popped up among the grass, and a swarm of insects gathered around her. By the time Auburn finally reached her, she was ready, and the first few waves of skeletons immediately got pulled back underground by roots and torn apart. After losing about a quarter of his army, Auburn halted the rest of them and walked up to meet his new opponent. A nature spirit, huh? Why do you stand in my way to protect a necromancer? This is none of your business and will only end in your death, he asked. Because she's cute, Familiar declared triumphantly and dragged some more skeletons back underground. She also managed to wrap the Inquisitor's feet in some roots before he noticed, but she was also at the limits of her ability to suddenly grow, and some of the undead still fought back, even after being mostly torn apart. Auburn returned the favor by reanimating a couple of skeletons directly behind the Spriggan. Unable to quickly respond to new threats anymore, she couldn't do anything before the skeletons grasped her arm and tore it off. While Familiar screamed in agony, her severed arm exploded into a bundle of vines that wrapped around the skeletons and crushed them. I warned you, do not meddle in necromancer business, Twig. I'll tear you apart, branch at a time if I have to. Auburn yelled and laughed when more and more skeletons kept popping up around Familiar. It didn't take long for his army to get back up to the numbers it had before the Spriggan's interference. The ground began to shake more and more. Familiar feared it was because even more undead soldiers were on their way to the surface, but the sudden terrified look on the Inquisitor's face suggested otherwise. Auburn began trying to free his legs from the vines in panic, but wasn't able to do so, before a massive ball of tightly packed bones rumbled past the Spriggan, over all of his skeletons, and finally over the Inquisitor himself. As the ball crumbled into a pile of bones 100 or so meters past him, the rest of the skeletons slowly crumbled as well. Anastasia had figured that even if she couldn't match the numbers in Auburn's disposal, she could easily match the raw mass, and did so with what was technically a single really big object. Zamiliere had given her. Completely out of breath, Anastasia ran to her friend and tried to apologize for her arm, but could only huff and puff apologizingly. It's fine, just go make sure that asshole is dead, and then maybe bring me a twig or branch or something. The Spriggan grunted in pain as more sap leaked from the stump of her arm. When Anastasia got to Auburn, he wasn't quite dead yet, but definitely too weak to attack her anymore. "You bitch, do you have any idea what you've caused?" he yelled and coughed up some blood. "I freed myself," Anastasia said and looked away from the dying Inquisitor. "No, you idiot. Others have begun to question our ways. There has already been some infighting, and if you don't go back, it'll turn into a war." He coughed with his last ounce of strength before going silent. Anastasia could feel the Inquisitor's body become more susceptible to her powers as he finally died. She didn't give a damn about the situation in Morn Valley. They could all die for all she cared, and if they killed each other, it would at least be easier for her. But that meant that they would likely become more and more desperate in their attempts to get her back, and there weren't many things more dangerous than a truly desperate necromancer. "It's fine. Take your time. I'll just bleed to death over here." Zamiliere reminded her about the grilling injury. Not that Spriggan could actually die from it, but the necromancer didn't know that. Anastasia looked around until she finally spotted a small sapling and fetched it for the Spriggan. "Oak. A wonderful choice," Zamiliere said and stabbed it into the stump. It began to take form immediately, but would still take some time to grow into an arm. "Now's your chance to taste some Spriggan's sap. It's considered a delicacy," she suggested and wiggled the stump. After hesitating a bit, Anastasia stuck her finger into the slightly glowing clear syrup and eating it. It was quite possibly the sweetest thing she had eaten, despite having eaten multiple spoonfuls of plain sugar after her arrival to Valor. "Look, I'm sorry you got mixed into my problems, so if there's anything I can. My room is always open. I can think of plenty of things you could do." The Spriggan interrupted her and winked. Anastasia groaned. "Didn't even miss a beat. You are literally the worst." She yelled and left back to the gate to tell the guards it was fine to open it again, leaving Zamiliere to regrow her arm alone. Chapter 12. Even those adventurers that didn't know what was transpiring outside the city's walls could tell that the mood inside Rosie's inn was heavy, ever since Anastasia had left, and for every passing minute, it somehow became ever more so. No one dared to make a single peep as the usually rather jolly giant of an adventurer stared at the table in front of him, while massaging his forehead with one hand, and almost crushing his bottle of mead with the other. Among the few that knew the newest addition to the inn's habitants, he was the only one who could even remotely grasp how terrifying it was to face off against a necromancer. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and gave Gilbert more time to retrace the trip back from Morn Valley, and doubt every choice he had made when trying to conceal their tracks. Amelia's willpower was under a constant test as well, and for every hopeful glance out the window to see if Anastasia was returning yet, she glanced at the bottles behind the counter, as well a tiny swig to calm her nerves, had rarely been as appealing. Rosie handled the stress of her new kitten being in danger by cooking. After a while she had already made more than enough snacks to last for the entire evening, but that didn't stop her from carrying on, just to have something to occupy her mind with. Gilbert had shared the news with the rest of Zamiliere's party as well, and though the nature spirit was no pushover, both Dammer and Maximilian were obviously worried for her, as well as for Anastasia. When Anastasia finally appeared in one of the windows and dragged herself inside, it was as if a great weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. She slumped down next to Gilbert and leaned back to take some deep breaths. "Ryu, I haven't ran this much since ever, probably. Can I get some water?" She sighed and glanced at her party mates. "Well, I was right about the skeleton belonging to a member of the Red Inquisition. Good news is that Zamiliere and I were able to kill this one, but he was the rookie of the team, and there's 6 more left, all of them trained to cut down other necromancers, and 2 of them are able to use living material to a degree." Gilbert's experience as an adventurer made him to immediately start looking for solutions or stopgap measures. Among the first ones of his ideas was traveling through Valor, and sneaking out from some other gate to look for help from other people capable of taking on necromancer inquisitors, such as other Spriggans. However, for a more detailed plan, he needed some more information about the threat they faced. "Are they strong?" he asked, as if there was a chance that people who were called Inquisitors wouldn't be. I mean, yes. If we go by the innate ability, they're not quite on my level, but they are all trained to use their abilities far more than me. I'm just a dropout that didn't finish almost any of the basic training they give to all children. Anastasia explained what she knew of the Inquisitors as individuals. One-on-one, I can maybe go against them with some chance of success, or at least almost all of them maybe, but unless there's something else they're needed for, I'm not seeing them giving me that chance after I already defeated one. Emilia had yet to be filled in on the Necromancer's circumstances, and she only knew that there was some trouble in the horizon, but nothing of the details. Inquisitors. The Necromancer ones. They won't attack the city, will they? She worried. Anastasia shook her head. They'd have to be desperate. I haven't been here for long, but this place is filled to brim with people that have the skills to go toe-to-toe with one of us, and maybe live to tell the tale. This is maybe the one place in the world they can't just walk into. They briefed the priestess about the ordeal that was getting Anastasia to Valor in the first place, and then moved on to make some rough outlines for their plan of action. Still tuckered by the marathon of a fight she had, the Necromancer retired for the day as soon as she had eaten her fill of Rosie's excess cooking, and left the returning Spriggan in charge of retelling the details of the fight to the rest of the regulars. The unconventional nature of the fight, as well as the rare team-up of a Necromancer and a Spriggan, made the slightly embellished story with an extremely romanticized ending rather popular that evening, and Zamiliere spent hours upon hours making sure that everyone knew how she saved Anne. Returning to her room from the baths, Anastasia could hear the usual laughter and merrymaking from the tavern, but was far too tired to even consider rejoining the crowd there. She still had a hard time believing the beds could be as comfortable and warm as the one she now had, even if it would have seemed rather basic for most people that hadn't spent their youth in Morn Valley. It definitely helped her forger about the unavoidable clash between her and the Red Inquisition, for long enough for her to almost fall asleep. Suddenly, an all too familiar gut-wrenching feeling came over Anastasia. The unmistakable presence of another Necromancer who had somehow snuck all the way to the other side of her door as she had rested her eyes. The overwhelming power of the unwelcome guest was enough to make the adventurer feel physically ill just by being nearby, making it clear that the Inquisitor she had faced earlier couldn't even begin to hope to be in the same weight class as the one behind the door. As the lock gave up from what seemed to nothing more than a slight push against the door, Anastasia prepared her daggers, immediately launching one at the crimson-robed figure that revealed itself when the door swung open. In what seemed to be an effortless move, the figure caught the dagger with their hand and jabbed it into the wall. Though the attack had been ineffective, it managed to confirm what were probably Anastasia's worst fears. The dim light shining through the window into her room had hit the Inquisitor's hand and revealed it to be entirely skeletal. "Kaquelikit!" screamed the adventurer and lobbed the other dagger by hand in panic, horribly missing the target and making it smack against the wall, pommel first. The Inquisitor stepped in and lowered the hood of her red robes. "Terribly on edge, are we?" the Necromancer called Kaquelikit asked with a slight smirk on her face. The second in command of the Red Inquisition, Kaquelikit, was a relatively tall woman, especially for a Necromancer. Her short, neatly kept, black hair was somewhat uncommon for the denizens of her country as well, who tended to have lighter hair more often than not, but these were far from being her most unique features, as the strangest one had her wear a customized, six-sleeved version of the Inquisitor's robes. According to a story pretty much everyone in the land of the Necromancers had heard, as a young student, Kaquelikit had acted against all the warnings, and tried to control her own arms through necromancy to increase their strength. As a result, both of them had gotten torn off under her immense abilities, and she had been left crippled. Of course, this did nothing but fuel Kaquelikit's ambitions, and she replaced the missing limbs with a considerably sturdier harness that supported 6 skeletal arms that could handle whatever she needed them for. Over the years, she had gained notoriety for being extremely violent, and often going out of her way to literally tear into her enemies with her new arms. Naturally, the next step for Anastasia was to try and wrestle the control of her arms away from the Inquisitor, but that turned out to be a fool's errand, as she possessed nowhere near enough skill to do anything in the few seconds she had, while Kaquelikit closed the door and calmly sat down on the bed. "Could you not?" the Inquisitor asked and shook her arms as if to rid them of what little influence Anastasia had gained over them. If I wanted to kill you, you'd be dead. If I wanted to kidnap you, we'd be in Morn Valley. So take a second to consider the situation before throwing your butter knives at guests. What do you want? Anastasia asked and backed up into the far corner of her bed. The Inquisitor chuckled. Morn Valley, I want a revolution, she said bluntly and began explaining. You and I both know that the cesspool of a regime that values their incestuous bloodlines, far more than what really matters, is overdue for a shift in power, and with a certain worryingly powerful brat out of their grasp. Some of us have figured that maybe it's time to show those royal weaklings that Morn Valley needs raw power far more than it needs the old ways and tradition. The adventurer couldn't have cared less for the politics of the country she had left behind, and couldn't really grasp what the Inquisitor was hinting at. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've come here with a deal. One you can't or won't reject. Coquelicot sighed. Morn Valley does not need an anchor or an immortal king, and with you out of the way, people are starting to finally listen to us. Your return would quickly revert any progress we've made, so I've come here to make sure you won't come back. So you're here to kill me after all, Anastasia screamed. Despite the Inquisitor not really doing anything threatening, she was having a hard time getting over the stories she had heard about Coquelicot. If you don't calm yourself, I might, Coquelicot said, clearly getting tired of trying to convince Anastasia of her peaceful intentions. You see, among the 7 members of the Red Inquisition, only Alizarin and I have chosen to abandon the old ways. This means we still need to deal with Carmine, Ceres, Crimson and lastly Amaranth, in order for this coup to be a successful one. Frankly, Alizarin isn't as much of a fighter as I'd like him to be, and I have my own limitations when it comes to fighting other Inquisitors. There are other matters that require our attention as well, and we can't spend our time hunting them down. That's where I come in, I assume? Anastasia asked. Exactly. Right now they are busy dealing with the aftermath of what we did to ease your escape, but once the rest of the Inquisitors learn what happened to Auburn, they will come for you regardless of your willingness to help me. Coquelicot nodded and stood up. So if anything, you should be thankful that I've come here to offer what help I can, but in return for dealing with my former coworkers, we also offer you complete freedom from the role of the anchor, and whatever comes after. She continued while taking out a book from a satchel she carried and placed it down on the small table. This tome is the first bit of help we can offer. If I were you, I'd heed to it. Now, I must make my leave, as I'm being tracked. We will give you all the time we can, so feel free to consider your lack of options. With that, the Inquisitor disappeared downstairs, and her oppressing presence faded away just as quickly as it had appeared. Somehow it didn't seem to cause any uproar in the tavern, even though the bright red Inquisitor was the opposite of inconspicuous. Anastasia picked up the book she had been gifted and ran her fingers over the title. Truth of Flesh and Bone, she muttered and flipped through the pages. Based on the titles of the chapters, she could tell that it dealt with combat-oriented necromancy, which was no doubt her biggest weakness, whether she wanted to admit it or not. As she inspected some of the more interesting-looking subjects, a small card fell from between the pages, which turned out to be a somewhat concerned-sounding message from the owner of the book. Dear Anastasia, this book contains most of the basics that are taught to all Inquisitors. Please study it thoroughly, and you will at least be able to meet your opponents on equal footing. On a more important note, please treat the book with care. It's the only copy in the world, and I wish to have it back. Alizarin. The adventurer groaned and tossed the card onto the floor. If her newfound allies' idea of help was trying to make her train, their friendship would be off to a very rocky start. Figuring that her party would probably appreciate knowing about Coquelicot's offer for help as soon as possible, Anastasia wandered back downstairs into the tavern and sought out her friends. On the way she had to deal with a bit of fallout from some rather questionable rumors the Spriggan had already managed to spread in the form of some lewd comments. Couldn't sleep? Emilia asked when the necromancer sat down next to her and Gilbert. Nah, too many Inquisitors in my room. Anastasia yawned. Did you seriously not see her? Tall, red, had 6 arms. Doesn't ring a bell. Shrugged Gilbert. Well, turns out that the 2 members of the Red Inquisition that were able to use living material like me aren't too happy with the way of things. Anastasia said and explained what had happened and what it meant in terms of opponents they had left to deal with. Emilia, now just about up to date with her knowledge on necromancy, nodded and pointed out something Anastasia hadn't even realized. So if we don't need to worry about these two that are like you, doesn't that mean we can help out properly, without being in constant danger of having our necks snapped? Anastasia's face lit up. You're right. It still won't be a walk in the park, but at least we're not limited to just me and Emmy fighting them now. Yeah, it's probably good for several reasons if you get some distance from her for a couple of days, Gilbert said, glared at a couple of adventurers that were glancing at the necromancer over their shoulders and whispering. Chapter 13. Despite being exhausted, Anastasia couldn't fall asleep that night. She tossed and turned in her bed, and every time she started to drift off to sleep, a knocker bump from somewhere woke her back up. It was pointless to even keep trying without finding a way to calm down first. By the time the moon had climbed all the way to the highest point in the sky, the sounds from the tavern downstairs had died down considerably, but some cheery chatter was still audible at times. So far in her life, Anastasia had spent almost all her nights in the complete silence of her home, so the background noise did take some getting used to, but ultimately it was nice, especially the happy tone of the other adventurers going about their business, something her life had seriously lacked so far. She sat up in her bed to take a look at the still surprisingly busy street under her window. Though the shops and boutiques had largely closed their doors for the day, the adventurers returning from taverns, guild offices and their quests still created a steady stream of people that was only just beginning to die down. Maybe a warm drink would help. The necromancer pondered and levered herself out of the bed to get dressed in whatever was the first piece of proper clothing she found in the dark. Before heading downstairs, she also grabbed the daggers from the small shelf attached to the headboard of her bed. Fiddling with a belt to have something to strap them onto turned out to be a challenge in the moonlight, and even after taking a while to do it, the belt ended up just being loosely held up on her hips, and kept sliding down when Anastasia walked. On the tavern's side, there were still a good number of adventurers having the time of their lives with the aid of a considerable amount of alcohol. She recognized a few of them, but getting caught up for too long wasn't her intention, so she decided to quietly slip into the kitchen to see if Rosie could help her. In the back of the kitchen, hidden from too many prying eyes, Anastasia found the innkeeper and Emilia intensely talking about something. She thought it was nice that the priestess was finally getting over her fear of Rosie. They didn't initially notice the necromancer sneaking up to them, but when she spoke up, the two quickly leaned a bit further away from each other. "What's up?" asked Anastasia from her startled friends. Rosie immediately stood up to pretend she was actually still doing something in the kitchen. "Oh, nothing, kitten. Miss Priestess here was just telling me about Sylvana," she said, very obviously just making it up on the fly, at least obviously to anyone but the necromancer. "Sylvia." Emilia backed up the claim. "Yeah, sure, that one." The innkeeper nodded. "Anyway, is something wrong? Are you having trouble sleeping?" she asked and kneeled to fix Anastasia's hair slightly. Even the naive necromancer could tell that something was up, but she was far too tired to even attempt to find out what. "A bit. Can't help but to think about all the stuff I've dragged you all into. I have friends for the first time in my life, and now they're all in danger because of me." She explained what had gone through her here during the evening. Rosie started to make some relaxing chamomile tea for both Anastasia and herself. "You don't need to worry about those kinds of things. You're not the first or the last person to drag their past here along with them. The deal is that every single adventurer will lay down their life for every other adventurer, and most of them will do it gladly, if it means fighting something unusual. I wouldn't put it past some of the people here to go out of their way to challenge these necromancers, just so they could tell the guild about it, and get some exclusive quests thrown at them." She explained and scoffed at Anastasia's worries. "If you say so." Anastasia accepted and took the cup of hot tea that was offered to her. "But it's not just that. If Emilia hadn't been outside today, I don't think I would be here now. I can't just keep running at problems and hoping that I keep getting lucky like that." Suddenly Emilia grabbed the necromancer's hand and squeezed it against her metal armor. "That's why Gil and I will be with you whenever you need help. Luck is no factor when you've got Lady Sylvia on your side," she said happily. "Thanks, maybe you're right, but I still need to do something. I think I'll just take my tea upstairs and start going through the book Aquila left for me." Anastasia smiled and took her leave. As she quickly passed by the tavern on her way to the stairs, Anastasia was spotted by the spriggan who had helped her. Familiar blew a kiss at her from across the room, but was completely ignored, as the necromancer picked up the pace to get to her faster after noticing the gesture. While Anastasia was obviously thankful and to a degree indebted to the spriggan, she was nowhere near thankful enough to even consider the nature spirit's constant barrage of extremely inappropriate advances. It definitely felt like a situation where giving her a finger would end with losing the entire arm, and then some. As she took out the book again, she happened to remember the bathhouse the guard had mentioned when she first arrived at Valor. Perhaps giving it a chance was what her nerves needed, or the party could take a new quest, and she could busy her mind with that. It was definitely something to bring up with Gilbert in the morning. To escape her dress once more, she absent-mindedly placed the cup of tea on the beautifully made leather cover, leaving a ring-shaped stain, and causing irreparable damage within a few hours of acquiring the precious tome. Oh great. Now even if I manage to pull this whole thing off, Alizarin will kill me for sure. She groaned and considered trying to lick the stain away, but remembered that the last one to touch the book was literally using a set of hands from a dead person. The cover of the book, in the traditional Mernvalian style, was fashioned from black leather and bound with extreme care and skill by the writer himself. The title was pressed into the cover and the spine and the letters had been carefully gilded. The contents were handwritten with meticulous accuracy and without a rushed sentence among them. Besides the stain that it now carried, the entire thing was in pristine condition, and felt like it had barely been opened before. Anastasia opened the book from the beginning and began reading out loud. The Truth of Flesh and Bone. How to Combat Rogue Necromancers. By Alizarin of the Red Inquisition. Oh fuck me, I'm so dead. Despite being equally likely to be her cause of death later down the line as the Inquisitors themselves, the book seemed like it would contain some extremely valuable information that would certainly help with her current troubles. Looking down the list of chapters, Anastasia read out loud a few of them. Basics of using necromancy against necromancers, improved control patterns, efficient usage of materials, flesh as material, bone as material, blood as material. Maybe it's better if I just go through the basics to be sure. She muttered and flipped through the foreword. Alizarin's handwriting was extremely on point, though slightly stylized. It was easy to read as opposed to some other malformed scribblings Anastasia had witnessed when studying before. The basics of fighting necromancers with necromancy are fairly simple. Everyone enters the battle with a plan. Yours is to successfully make sure the enemy fails to execute theirs. Only after that is it your time to swiftly end the fight with your preferred method. To do this, it is absolutely imperative that you study the fugitive before doing anything, as every necromancer that wishes to fight effectively has to choose a specialization, and knowing your opponents is the single most beneficial piece of intel there is. Knowing this allows you to plan accordingly and oftentimes outmaneuver even those stronger than you. But the limitation of methods is just as much of a requirement to you, and as Inquisitors, you are required to learn and perfect your methods to a point that no one is able to surpass you. Think of your abilities as a scalpel, sharp beyond comparison, but only a single edge. Necromancers so powerful that they can make it as a jack of all trades are rare beyond belief, and even then, it is both my predecessors and my belief that they are wasting their potential. A specialization can be anything from infinite options, but should be chosen based on your natural gifts. If you have gained access to this tome, you likely know the limits of your abilities, so take a moment to consider your options. Some necromancers find it naturally easier to command massive armies of thralls. Some are able to control powerful beings. Some have a natural affinity to work on the very fringes of their range. Others find their powers lessen harshly after only a few meters. These are mere examples in an infinite ocean of variations. With these specializations comes an inevitable game of rock, paper, scissors, and in this line of work, you will run into situations where everything seems to be stacked against you. Which brings us back to my first point. Your opponent having a rock against your scissors only matters if you allow them to cast that stone. Use the intel you've gathered to overwhelm and shut down your opponent as quickly as possible. Anastasia had never even thought about having a specialization, not that she ever needed one. So far raw power had worked just fine, and any teachers that had taught her had given up way before something so advanced even came up. which was likely the reason for her troubles as well. She had never learned to be effective or efficient. If she was supposed to think of her powers as a weapon of any kind, it would have definitely been a wooden mallet. So perhaps she needed to backtrack even further, and find out how to use her uncontested prowess efficiently in the first place. She could have torn the control of the skeletons away from Auburn, and she could have taken over Cuquelicot's arms, but she simply didn't know how to go about doing it. Whether it was the tea or the book, after going through the rest of the first chapter, the necromancer felt like she could calm down enough to get some sleep. She placed the note from alizarin between the pages to mark where she had gotten to, and carefully hid the tome under her bed to shield it from any further damage. The sounds from the tavern had died down as well, and the streets had been almost empty for a while. After a couple more checks for necromancers nearby, Anastasia was finally able to doze off and fall asleep. Though most of the adventurers had found their way into their rooms upstairs, Gilbert and Dammer were still smoking their pipes and chatting at a pace of a few words every couple of minutes. With them in the tavern were a few other adventurers that represented nocturnal beast folk races, and only really came out at night, as well as Holly, who simply sat behind the counter and stared at the patrons without blinking. The dwarf emptied the ashes from his pipe and started packing a new batch of tobacco in it. "She's quite something, that girl of yours," he said while working on his pipe. "She'll be a heck of an adventure." "Aye." Gilbert nodded and puffed smoke at his empty tankard. "She'll outgrow this old man eventually. I just hope it'll take long enough for me to save money for a peaceful retirement." "Are these words coming out of my friend's mouth, or did you get replaced by someone? You know just as well as I that men like us will meet our end out there, and we're lucky for it," Dammer boasted, and both of the old adventurers laughed heartily. "On a related note, have a look at this," he continued and slid a folded piece of paper over the table. Gilbert opened it and raised his brows at the number written at the bottom. "That's a lot of gold," he muttered. "That it is. It's these scholarly types that get their funding from some crowned head. I was thinking that it's enough work and reward for 6. Goblins can be a bit of a hassle with just 3 pairs of hands, not to mention machine forts." Dammer nodded and lit his pipe. "I need to run it by the ladies, but they're both eager to prove themselves, so I feel like they'll take the bait," Gilbert said and handed the note back to his friend. "But how about another round of drinks first?" Chapter 14. What felt like mere seconds of shut-eye, Anastasia was woken up by the sun shining through her window. Completely unrefreshed and already in a foul mood because of it, she cursed the light that would have usually provided her with a comfortable, gradual awakening, but for whatever reason felt like it was now burning her eyes. The sun being far too bright was but the beginning of her list of complaints from the first minute of being awake. The room was too hot, the bed creaky, the noises from downstairs too loud, and the scent of breakfast too tempting. The yellow dress she had used last night was crumbled up on the floor where she had tossed it after coming back to her room with her tea. Anastasia groaned, picked it up and forcibly pulled it on herself without bothering to open any of the buttons. Since brushing her hair, looking for a matching pair of socks and putting on a belt seemed like completely impossible tasks at the time, she chose to give up on them, and instead headed downstairs without so much as a glimpse in the mirror. In the tavern, she stumbled into the first empty seat she could see and collapsed on it, ignoring whoever she happened to join for breakfast. Sommelier and Maximilian stared at the wreck of a necromancer that had tossed herself to their table, and reached over to make sure she was still alive, after not moving at all for over 10 seconds. "Your appearance leaves something to be desired. Is something amiss?" the elf asked. He had so far considered Anastasia as someone who puts at least a bit of effort to her looks, a trait not as common as one would think among the adventurers, and he was surprised to see her in such a ghastly condition. The only answer he received was a short, miserable wail that sounded like a small animal dying. "I still think you're cute, so all is not lost." The Spriggan smiled warmly and pinched Anastasia's cheek. Rosie appeared from the kitchen, coincidentally with Maximilian and Sommelier's orders of various breakfast foods, including sausages, fried eggs and salad. She tried to greet the necromancer with a pat on the head, but the answer to it was much like the previous one, though a bit longer. "Is she okay? Her dress is on backwards," the innkeeper asked and shook Anastasia gently. "I'm fine," the necromancer yelled and suddenly sprung awake. "But I think I may have died at some point during the night. Maybe a coffee and a ham sandwich will fix that. The tigress quickly did what she could to Anastasia's hair and returned to the kitchen to prepare her order. As soon as the innkeeper had disappeared to the kitchen, Emilia slipped into the tavern from the staircase, where she had very clearly been waiting until Rosie was gone. She quickly peeked into the kitchen and wandered to her party mate's table. Though the priestess herself looked a bit frumpy, as she often did in the mornings, it was nothing compared to the state Anastasia was in. Noticing this, Emilia warily tried shaking the necromancer and looked at the other two adventurers for answers. "Why is she like that?" she asked and sat down. "She's dead." The Spriggan shrugged while moving most of her salad to Maximilian's plate, and in return, taking most of the meat on his. "Oh. I've been there. Anna, how much did you have and when did you even get the chance to drink? I mean, you shouldn't be drinking in the first place is what I was supposed to say. At least wait until the priestess started, but immediately fell quiet when Rosie returned with Anastasia's order. "Here you go, kitten," the innkeeper said and pretended to only then notice Emilia. Good morning, Miss Priestess. I hope you had a good rest," she continued awkwardly. Emilia pulled up the collars on her uniform and avoided looking directly at the innkeeper. "Thank you, Rosie. Could I maybe get a cup of coffee, please?" she mumbled and stared at the table in front of her. "Of course, you are a patron here after all," the tigress responded stiffly and fiddled with the beads on her hair. Emilia had immediately picked up on the curious tension between the two, and leaned closer with the smuggest of grins on her face. "Utufu" was the only thing she managed to say before Rosie hurled her across the floor into a corner, where the Spriggan kept laughing uncontrollably. Maximilian, and probably everyone else who had overheard the awkward conversation, had come to the same realization as Emilia, but unlike her, the elf knew better than to say anything about it, and simply kept eating his breakfast in silence. The first couple of sips of the strong, dark coffee had revived the necromancer from her death-like state, but she had missed everything that had happened around her during it. Taking a bite from her sandwich, she failed to read the situation at all, and simply wondered why the Spriggan was on the floor all of a sudden. Anastasia's mood had been salvaged by caffeine and ham from absolutely awful to just somewhat terrible, and by the time Gilbert joined them in the tavern, she had woken up to a point where she almost noticed her dress being on backwards. "Good morning, everyone," the old adventurer greeted his friends and sat down with them. Thanks to the years of waking up at a moment's notice when on the road, Gilbert was one of those strange people who both looked and sounded about as good as they could only seconds after rolling out of their bed, much in contrast to the rest of his party. "Since you're all here, I've got something to discuss," he said and made his order by simply waving at Rosie as she passed a nearby table. "Dammer found a quest that pays well enough for 6 people. He wanted to know if we'd be interested in joining forces." The necromancer perked up immediately after hearing the word quest. "Yes. What kind of a quest? Is it another monster hunt? I had fun on the last one," she asked and grabbed Gilbert's arm. "Basically, there's a machine fortress a couple of days' walk from here. Some goblins have been amassing around it and are trying to get inside. No idea why, but some scholar from the north thinks it's worth checking out, and is willing to throw quite a bit of gold at us, if we figure out why the goblins are there," the old adventurer explained while tracing a crude map of the trip they would take on the surface for the table. "The reward alone is almost 50,000 gold per person, and those machine fortresses are full of artifacts and doodads that sell well to collectors." Her eyes shining with childlike glee, Anastasia buried her nails into Gilbert's forearm in excitement. "Actual ruins to explore, what are we waiting for? Let's go," she exclaimed and was ready to dart up from her seat. Gilbert winced and pried the necromancer's hands off his arm. "Calm down, Anna. Emilia hasn't said anything yet, and even if she's on board, we need to prepare and accept the quest at the guild offices," he said and took out his pipe. "For starters, everyone needs camping equipment, food rations and an assortment of other gear. We'll spend at least 2 days on the road just to get there, and I'm not carrying you this time." Though not even a third of the trip from Morn Valley to Valor, walking for 2 days straight would definitely be taxing for the necromancer, who wasn't used to such feats, and had spent most of her first trip to the City of Adventurers complaining and whining about her legs hurting, even though she was carried for almost the entire time, so she wouldn't fall behind. "Sounds exciting," The priestess nodded with a slight glimmer of gold in her eyes. I could certainly use the money. And here I thought you found alternative means of paying for your stay. The Spriggan laughed from the corner she had been tossed into. Amelia adjusted her armor slightly and ignored the comment. I promised to look after you two anyway, so count me in if you're going. She nodded. It would be interesting to see both Miss Priestess and Anastasia in combat. I only have limited experience from people like you. Maximilian wondered out loud and moved the conversation back to its original rails. This made Anastasia realize that she was actually interested in seeing how a regular party without necromancers or divine assistants handled things. She had already seen Zamillier's capabilities and understood why she hadn't been kicked out yet, but the two other members were still largely a mystery to her. She remembered reading something from what was likely a firmly outdated book about elves, often favoring bows whenever they could, and she had even seen Maximilian with one. Dammer seemed similarly stereotypical, and according to the same book, dwarves favored heavier weapons like axes and maces. Maximilian was also intrigued by the purpose of the quest. Why would goblins care about a machine fortress? Those poor critters can barely sharpen sticks and stones, much less find a use for ancient technology. It's probably something idiotic like always. Zamillier scoffed with an obvious taint of disdain in her voice, while getting up and wiping the dust off her clothes. For Spriggans that hadn't abandoned their original job as guardians of nature, goblins were the bane of their existence. They hunted down all wildlife around their camps, damaged the trees irreversibly, and occasionally burned entire forests whenever a goblin tribe discovered fire. Even now as an adventurer, she held no affection or pity for them. I hope the fort's traps have taken care of them by the time we arrive, and all we'll find is dismembered bits of those green bastards. She continued and returned to the table. Actually, now that I think about it'd be great if they hadn't. I'd go there just to watch the traps tear them apart. You wouldn't even need to pay me. Everyone looked slightly worried when hearing about the Spriggan's sudden thirst for blood, and Gilbert decided that it was time to change the subject. Okay, make sure all your gear is in good condition. We're departing early in the morning. The terrain on the way there is pretty pleasant, but we won't be able to travel on roads. We can, however, follow a river most of the way there, so water shouldn't be a problem. He listed what he knew of the route they would take to the fortress. I can carry some of the heavier pieces of gear someone might have, if that's a problem. It shouldn't be too cold even during the night, so as long as everyone has a cape or cloak, it should be fine. Anastasia made a mental list about the things she needed before leaving: a cloak, something to make fire with, a pan or pot to boil water and make food in, and a lantern, were some of the things Gilbert had suggested earlier, and probably all she could carry. Her armor and weapons were still in good condition, so those had to do for the time. While she was deep in thought, Zamillier snuck behind her and grabbed her tightly. Don't you worry, my dear. I shall keep you very safe from those horrific creatures. She reassured the necromancer with an uncomfortably friendly whisper. I'm starting to regret not letting you bleed to death. Anastasia sighed and wiggled herself free. After quickly popping by her room to fix her shaggy appearance at least partially, the impatient necromancer headed out to find what she needed for the quest, particularly a cloak. Gilbert had said that he needed to resupply as well and could get most of the gear for everyone while he was out. On her way to the nearest shop with a decent selection of cloaks and capes that had been pointed out to her, the necromancer mused on the best color for her new apparel. A lightly colored one would always look dirty, so something like dark forest green or deep blue would be better. She wasn't a fan of brown either, but the only thing she was completely, absolutely, 100% sure was that she would not get a black one. Barring some special cases, black was the color of nearly all uniforms and clothes in her home country, and she felt it would have led to some stereotypical implications, combined with her otherwise pasty appearance. By the time she reached the shop and could take a gander at the display window, she had gotten so caught up in her thoughts that she had begun talking to herself. How does Amelia keep her white cloak so damn clean? She was literally sleeping outside just a few days ago. Does Sylvia or whoever do her laundry too? That seems like a waste of a miracle. She rambled without noticing the slightly worried looks she was starting to gather. The couple of cloaks on display were rather promising with their colors and patterns, so Anastasia figured there was a fair chance that she would find something suitable. Immediately upon entry, the scowling young, smartly dressed elf with sleek dark hair sitting behind the counter gave her a piercing glare. "What do you need? Are you sure you should even be here? You look like you belong on the streets." He mercilessly insulted his potential new customer. I'm looking for a cloak." Anastasia stuttered, baffled by the rudeness. The tailor put down whatever he was working with and rolled his eyes. Yes, I would try to hide that hideous dress as well." He mocked the attire Anastasia had carefully selected among her first few outfits after arriving to Valor. He then got up from his seat and began perusing the stacks of folded cloaks behind the counter and kept shaking his head. After a while, he decided on 3 and dropped them in front of the necromancer before returning to his work, which appeared to clearly interest him far more than whatever business Anastasia could bring. "Why are all of these black?" "I had something more colorful in mind," Anastasia wondered, and pointed at the more colorful piles of fabric. "Colors are for people who can handle them. You have all the stylishness of a stale biscuit. The nice thing about black is that anyone can look at least decent in it, or in your case, at least it helps to hide you in the shadows," the elf said curtly, clearly annoyed by further questions. As she went through her options, Anastasia couldn't help but to wonder if she could make it far enough from the shop before someone discovered a certain elf with every single bone in his body broken, and whether they would actually care if this asset was in agony. Either way, she came to a conclusion that it wasn't worth the trouble, and she got the feeling that the tailor and his attitude were living on borrowed time regardless. Trying on the first cloak, Anastasia almost tripped on it, which probably meant that it wasn't ideal for traveling on foot. The second of the dreadfully colorless cloaks was the complete opposite, barely reaching her knees. It was disqualified after the necromancer figured that it was almost pointless to have, even with a dress or skirt. Forced to settle on the third one, she threw it on herself and moved around a bit. Though the color was not what she was after at all, she couldn't deny that it sat rather well on her, and that the material was warm and comfortable. The hood was somewhat large and blocked her vision entirely when pulled up, but it would have to do, as the necromancer was far too anxious to leave for another quest to bother finding a shop with a less hostile atmosphere that could wait until she had the money to have a cloak made specifically to her, in whatever color she damn well wanted. "Guess I'll take this one," Anastasia said and took out her purse. The elf begrudgingly accepted the payment, but not without one last insult. "Just keep the hood on, you look better when I can't see your face." The necromancer clenched her fists and bit her tongue to fight the temptation to teach the tailor a lesson. She truly had no idea how someone like him wasn't dead already. Chapter 15. As the kilometers passed, Anastasia grew more and more unhappy with the situation. She had reached her limit after only 20 kilometers of traveling, and more than half of it while simultaneously complaining relentlessly. "By the time we get there, my feet will be nothing but mush in my boots," she wailed dramatically. The necromancer had tried to bargain with everyone present for them to carry her, even just for a little while, but the old adventurer attempting to mentor her had remained adamant that no one should accept her offers. Eventually, however, even Zamiliere was starting to reach her limit for endless complaining. "Come on, Gil, just let me carry her to end this," the Spriggan pleaded. Gilbert scoffed at the idea. "No. She needs to learn how to walk. As an adventurer, there's a lot of time on the road in her future. If it weren't for the constant complaining, it would have been a perfect day for walking." The weather was warm, but an occasional cooling breeze washed over the riverside occasionally. Not a single cloud was in sight anywhere, and the nature was in full bloom around them, even without the help of the nature spirit. This led to a good mood for everyone able to ignore the noise, namely the 3 other members of the party, who were engaged in a telling of some other quests Zamiliere, Dammer and Maximilian had been involved in. Though they all seemed exaggerated, even the relatively straight-laced elf vouched for their accuracy. "I still find it improbable that you guys just went and dropped a huge rock on the drake living around Snowtop. I'm pretty sure I've heard that the local duke had lost entire armies trying to get at that thing." Emilia pondered, still skeptical about the whole story. Dammer chortled. "Wasn't anything just about it. Days of baiting the damn thing, almost having Max get eaten 3 separate times, and we only barely avoided getting crushed with it," he pointed out. "It was great." "Still just the 3 of you, huh?" The priestess smirked. The general merriness of their party despite her agony annoyed Anastasia even further, to a point where she started tossing rocks and sticks into the river by them, just to blow off some steam. And then there's this bitch of a river that just flows in the wrong direction just to spite me. She cursed the natural formation that most certainly did not intentionally mess with her, and had flowed exactly the same way for far longer than the necromancer had been alive. Hoping to at least partly improve Anastasia's mood, Sommelier tried her best to get her to consider the positive side of things. That does mean we can just use a raft to get back though, did you think about that? Trust me, that's easily the worst part of the trip, she said. Not having any of it, the necromancer continued her childish tirade. That also means you can go fuck yourself. I'd much prefer if you, the Spriggan managed to say before Gilbert interrupted her with a glare that was easy to read as a threat of her being the next thing to find themselves in the river if she continued. Running about 10 meters wide and half of that in depth, the fairly slowly flowing river appeared harmless at a glance, but in fact had very steep banks that would easily crumble if one was to stray too near to the edge. Gilbert knew of this and used it as a subject for a lecture to distract Anastasia, by explaining why getting her gear wet on day one of a quest was quite possibly the worst idea easily available. He also knew of a spot only a few kilometers ahead, where the river curved sharply enough to have a shallower inner bank that was ideal for a camp. The problem was that getting a few more kilometers out of the necromancer was starting to become a rather tall order, and during the lecture, she had simply given up and laid down on the grass as a protest, until everyone agreed to take a break. Anna, it's already well past noon. If we start taking breaks now, we'll never make it before dark. I'd rather not have to start looking for firewood when it's already dark, would you? Gilbert tried his best to explain why he was pushing the necromancer to move. I get that you're tired and that your feet hurt, but sometimes you just need to deal with a bit of pain, that's life. Well, I guess this is where I die then. It was nice knowing you all, don't forget me. Anastasia said without a hint of sarcasm in her voice. The old adventurer sighed and caved in. He grabbed Anastasia by the waist and tossed her onto his shoulder like a sack of grain. Wigging triumphantly, the necromancer tried to move into a better position. Could you at least turn me around so I can see where we're going? No. Gilbert answered gruffly, while the others clearly found his defeat humorous. And so, with the apprentice adventurer no longer dragging them down, the party's pace improved quite a bit for the rest of the day's journey. For the last couple of kilometers, the river entered a thick forest, and the roots of the massive old trees grew above ground, occasionally creating obstacles to the path they followed. Everyone aside from the nimble elf and the Spriggan found them cumbersome at the end of the day's journey, especially Dammer, who could barely get over the larger roots. Gilbert also noted that the older forest, like the one they were in, were far more dangerous in the dark, exemplifying why sticking to your travel plans was important after all. Both the worst beasts and worst people roads and wilderness had to offer came out after dark. We have a literal nature spirit with us, why do we need to worry about woodland critters? Anastasia wondered out loud. My word doesn't exactly carry the weight it did back when I was actually guarding nature. Plants are one thing, but my relations with the bulk of my kind is complicated, and the beasts know it. Sommelier explained and made a flower bloom on the tip of her wooden finger. Not despising people is an unpopular choice when it comes to Spriggans. So, you're like exiled or something? Inquired the necromancer. Yes and no, it's more like a mutual shunning. There's no one to actually tell us what to do, so even if most of us feel like guarding the nature is what we're meant to do, others prefer freedom, and the two don't mix. The nature spirit shrugged. She clearly didn't lose sleep over the matter. Not having to walk allowed Anastasia to focus more on her surroundings, and she found the forest rather pleasant. The ancient grand trees grew tall and far enough apart to let some light in, and the aroma of the underbrush was the complete polar opposite of the stench of decay and rot she grew up in. Perhaps, one day, when she had adventured enough for the time being, she could build a small hut in such a place. Her dreams of being a forest hermit were interrupted by the party finally reaching their desired camping site just in time before the sunset. Maximilian, Sommelier and Dammer immediately scattered to prepare the site, having done it hundreds of times before. They all knew their jobs. While Maximilian went to get a deer he had been tracking for a while now, Dammer checked the perimeter for anything that felt off, and Zamiliere gathered enough firewood for the night. Gilbert and Emilia were left with the task of starting a fire. Anastasia was put in charge of getting some water from the river for cooking, so she grabbed the pot graciously loaned to them by the innkeeper, and kneeled by the stream. To her surprise, the water was incredibly clear, which allowed her to see all the way to the bottom a couple of meters from the bank. A couple of larger fish were laying in wait for a suitable prey to swim by, which gave her an idea for something she could impress her party with. She pointed her hand towards one of them and started moving it closer to her. Though it seemed to be working, suddenly the fish violently exploded into a mess of blood, scales and fish bones. Getting caught in the edge of the blast radius was enough to make the necromancer throw up on the spot. A slightly wooden, muffled giggle echoed from among the trees as the Spriggan escaped from the scene, having witnessed the ordeal. After moving a bit upstream to get water with owfish mush and vomit in it, Anastasia returned to the camp, having somehow been defeated by the task of filling a pot with water. Luckily, Maximilian's hunt had ended a lot more successfully, and he brought with him some freshly butchered meat. Though the elf hated wasteful hunting for cultural reasons, he knew his friends would surely appreciate any and all variety in the relatively bland selection of jerky, potatoes, carrots and stale bread they could carry with them. He also made it a point to teach the new adventurers about leaving the parts of the carcass he couldn't take with him, or wouldn't have been pleasant to eat without aging well away from the camp, to make sure the predator that would end up scavenging them wouldn't find its way there. While cooking and during the subsequent feast, the adventurers planned for the night. For now, things have been peaceful, but don't take it for granted. Since I knew about this place, other people do too, and some of those people might be of a nastier sort. Gilbert lectured the two fresh adventurers in his party. That's something to keep in mind. We're still fairly close to Valor, so it's unlikely that we'll see any highwaymen or the like. Thieves may be, but they might have people check on this place every now and then. I should also mention that there were some wolf tracks in the woods. Maximilian pointed out. They know we're here, but there's a lot of us, so a normal-sized pack wouldn't bother us, especially if we keep the fire burning throughout the night. Gilbert pondered the situation for a while. We'll stay up in pairs. I'll start with Anna for now, he decided. I can take the second shift. Emilia offered. I'll join you. Zamiliere quickly exclaimed and raised her hand. We have much to discuss. Dammer glanced at Maximilian and they nodded in unison. Works for us. We tend to wake up early anyway, so just wake us up when you need to. Well, after the darkness had already fallen on the forest, the party went to sleep by a large tree that grew a bit closer to the river than others. It didn't take long for a quiet snoring to begin after a long day of walking, and the only ones left awake were the necromancer and her mentor. They began their watch by brewing some coffee on the fire. Say, Anna, I've been thinking, Gilbert suddenly said. You do that a lot, so I'd expect as much, quipped Anastasia before the old adventurer had the chance to continue. Ignoring the remark, Gilbert continued. Can't you just sense anything that comes near the camp, even if it's completely dark? As long as they're flesh and blood, that is. The necromancer shrugged. For 50 to 70 meters maybe, if I focus. Right now, there's like birds or bats or whatever in the trees, nothing bigger than that. That's still much further than where I can see in the dark, especially into the forest. Can you keep checking it every once in a while? I don't want to be surprised by another ogre, suggested Gilbert. He was starting to realize that necromancers had several convenient traits and abilities for adventures. It was a shame they were all huddled up in their own grim nook of the world. As they passed the night by drinking coffee and chatting about this and that, something a bit larger came to check on the camp just on the very edge of Anastasia's range. It stirred the adventurers slightly and woke them up properly before retreating back into the forest. To calm things once more, Gilbert figured that he should tell Anastasia about the machine fortresses, since they were heading to one. Not that much is known about them, but a long time ago, there was a powerful kingdom that had a peculiar way of building their cities, or fortresses underground for some reason. Though the kingdom itself is long gone, their creations still churn on around the world. The general consensus on the machine fortresses is that each one had the capability to create simulacra, and that the active ones are still somehow doing it. No one knows why or how, but that's how it seems to be. So why haven't all of them been looted by now? I'm sure all that old stuff is worth something to someone. The necromancer wondered. No one can seem to find a way in. The entrances are always hidden and fortified beyond belief, so even getting into an inactive one is a heck of a task. The old adventurer explained. Then there's the traps that some of them have, or all of them for all we know, and the active ones are just a no-go, since they tend to have simulacra guarding them. The one we're heading to is supposed to be an inactive one though, so we shouldn't have much issues getting to it, but it does make the goblins gathering around it even more interesting. Chapter 16. As the sun rose over the treetops on the opposite side of the river, it shone its light directly onto Anastasia's face, waking her up into the morning filled with songs of birds from the tall trees, and the pleasant aroma of the coffee brewing on their campfire. The air hadn't quite warmed up yet, and the grass around her was still moist with morning dew, but the first rays of light had already began to change that for the warmer. Ah, the young one awakens. Maximilian greeted the necromancer from the side of the campfire with a smile and a wave of a stick with a roasted perch on it. The breakfast will be ready in a couple of minutes. You should take this chance to freshen up. Only barely registering what was being said at all, Anastasia looked around in a groggy daze. While Maximilian and Dammer had been awake for hours already, both Gilbert and Amelia had the same vacant look on their faces, the one people get when they wake up in a forest after barely enough sleep. In the other end of the spectrum, there was Amelia, whose body had grown several flower buds overnight, and seemed just overall healthier than usually, like a houseplant that had been watered. In her daze, the necromancer kept staring at the Spriggan and let her mind wander off. She started questioning the Spriggan's need for sleep in the first place, or if they actually needed to eat at all. She had seen it happen several times, but Zamilier's body was literally made out of plants, so why didn't she simply grow some roots and eat nutrients from the soil, like plants are supposed to do? Delighted by the befuddled attention she was receiving, Zamilier winked at the necromancer. Go ahead and admire, touching is also allowed. She whispered. You make no sense, Anastasia mumbled tiredly, stumbled up from the ground, and started wobbling towards the river. The best things never do, the Spriggan answered. The water was clear, cool and refreshing, and was able to rinse off most of the necromancer's remaining drowsiness as she washed her face. For reasons unknown to her, there were several flowers placed in her hair, many of which didn't even grow anywhere nearby. She considered leaving them be, but ended up deciding against it, because of an inexplicable chill in her spine when she touched them. While washing her still sore feet, she happened to realize there were no fishes by the riverbank, large or small. On a closer inspection, she found out that there were none anywhere nearby. Curious, she focused for a while longer, and tried to find a reason for their absence, until suddenly, she could feel something massive slowly drift across the bottom of the river. She quickly lifted her feet from the water and moved a bit further away. Guys, there's something big in the river, she reported her findings as the mystery creature slid out of her range. Dammer walked up to the river and gazed into the water. Like a fish or something? He asked. All I know is that it was huge. Anastasia explained and spread her arms as wide as she could to show what she meant. I think it swam away though. Could have been a sturgeon, they grow over twice as large as a man, and sometimes swim through here. The dwarf guessed, considerably less stressed about it than the necromancer. But whatever it was, it's in the water and we're on solid ground, so let us not dwell on it and have breakfast instead. Anastasia hesitantly left the riverbank to join the others for a quick meal, before they had to continue their journey. Though she had grown up with food meager in both amount and taste, the delicious and full plates at the inn had quickly increased her standards. She stared at the piece of bread with a small pile of fish meat on it, and couldn't help but to find it a bit lacking. A bit of butter would have gone a long way to make it more appetizing, but the necromancer understood that it was as good as it was going to get on the road and didn't complain. After eating and extinguishing their campfire, it was time to continue walking. Though they were still sore, sleeping had successfully turned the aching of Anastasia's feet into a more muted pain that felt like she could just walk it off, and to a large degree, it worked. Instead of slowing everyone down by dragging her feet, this time she chose to lead the party along the side of the river. with the weather just as amicable as on the day before and their most troublesome member full of energy, at least for now, the party started to make good progress towards their goal. However, after only a kilometer or so, Anastasia spotted something weird by the side of the river. Covered in rocks and seaweed, a half-butchered deer carcass laid on the ground with its back legs in the water. Even from afar, she could tell that it hadn't been killed by wolves, but did appear to have been dragged for a good distance. What blood it still had in it had long since congealed, which made the necromancer a bit less hesitant to approach it out of curiosity. "Well, that is odd," Maximilian noted when he noticed the carcass. "What is?" Gilbert asked. The elf pointed at the dead deer. "That's the one I caught, but I left it deep into the forest." It took a second for the gears to turn in Gilbert's head as he watched Anastasia creep closer to the deer. Perhaps because it was still so early, he didn't immediately connect the dots, but as soon as he did, the old adventurer dashed forwards and yelled, "Anna, get away from the water." But he was only a moment too late in his warning. As the necromancer turned around to see why she was being yelled at, an eerily familiar large mass shot across the bottom of the river at an incredible speed, and emerged from the water before Anastasia even realized it. The creature appeared vaguely horse-like, but pale green and partly covered in slimy scales, with a large fin running down its neck, and a second set of bulging fish-like eyes next to the usual pair. The creature latched its teeth on the necromancer's boot, and using its far larger mass, dragged her into the river before she could do anything about it. It swiftly moved all the way to the bottom and placed its foot on Anastasia's chest, holding her down while emotionlessly staring into her eyes, and waiting for her to drown. Her vision quickly darkened as she began to run out of air. At the surface, the party that had worked together for years started acting immediately, before Gilbert could come up with anything, and Amelia even properly realized what was going on. Dammer snapped his fingers and caught a dagger Maximilian threw at him. "Sammy, get us back up," he ordered the Spriggan, and without hesitation, lunged into the river. The dwarf's heavy gear and generally dense build quickly took him to the bottom, and right next to the beast, where he jabbed the knife into the creature's neck a few times, causing it to bleed profusely. Wisely, it took this as the tide of the fight turning against it, and escaped down the river, before the dwarf had the chance to completely gore it, leaving behind a trail of red in the water. As several vines reached down from the surface and started wrapping themselves around Dammer, the dwarf grasped onto Anastasia and tugged on one of the vines. The Spriggan struggled to drag both of them up, but wasn't about to let her new necromancer drown just like that. Both Gilbert and Amelia grabbed onto the vines that had grown from her back and helped with the pulling, until finally, the pair resurfaced and Dammer rolled Anastasia onto the riverbank. To everyone's relief, she started to cough up water as soon as Amelia lightly whacked her on the back, and seemed to be fine. The devotee tapped her back a couple more times before turning her attention to the foot the creature had bitten. "Looks like the boot took the brunt of it. It's going to leave a bruise, but I'm not seeing a wound or anything. You live." She diagnosed and moved the ankle to make sure it wasn't broken either. "What was that?" the necromancer managed to ask between coughs. Gilbert, who was keeping a watch on the river just in case, obviously knew the answer. "That would be a kelpie, or rather rare aquatic beastie in these parts. They can turn into a hideous lanky human-like creature to crawl onto land, where they'll look for carcasses to bait other animals with like that. They're big but honestly can't put up much of a fight even in water, but can still be dangerous if you get caught unaware. If you have to fight one, even a relatively minor injury is enough to get them to back off," he explained briefly. "You owe these 3 a round or 2 once we get back home." "Thanks," the necromancer uttered. "It's quite all right, hardly a quest if someone doesn't almost die from something unrelated." Dammer laughed and tossed the dagger back to Maximilian. "But I will take a free drink." The elf simply bowed politely and started drying his weapon. The vines growing off Amelia withered and snapped off when she moved to embrace Anastasia. "Or no," Amelia immediately stated. Since their gear were now thoroughly wet, Anastasia and Dammer had to take what armor they had off to let it and their clothes dry in the sun as they walked. The day being warm, it wasn't an issue, and the Spriggan was more than happy to carry Anastasia's things. Not that long into their walk, the necromancer started to once more complain about her legs, this time pointing at the one that had been attacked. While it was bruised, it actually didn't hurt all that much, and that much was obvious for anyone who could read Anastasia's poor acting. However, Gilbert simply didn't have the energy to spend another day arguing about it, so he begrudgingly picked the girl up on his shoulder, and the journey once more continued unhindered. Despite the almost lethal interruption, it started to look like that party was going to make it to the machine fortress well before dark. Their plan was to camp out by the outer perimeter of the fortress and figure out an approach once they got there. Typically, goblins weren't hostile, and camping near them wasn't an issue, as long as you kept an eye on your gear. Any harm they caused was typically accidental and even more often than that, aimed at themselves. The world generally considered them a nuisance and didn't understand them, and they certainly did not understand the world. Some of them could talk and understand speech to a degree, and in no cases had the cunning to lie about anything, so there was a chance, however small, that the entire quest could be completed by asking a goblin why they were there. Late in the afternoon, Gilbert pulled out his map and compared it to a few landmarks he could see, and the shape of the river. The fort should be on the other side of that hill. So, before we go, remember, we don't want any trouble with the goblins. Am I making myself clear, Sommelier? He reminded the party. Ah. The brigand scoffed. Do as you may, but you're just as likely to step on their holy turnip or whatever, or accidentally insult them by scratching your chin. We'd be better off by just going in and wiping them all out. Maximilian was appointed as the scout, so he ran ahead of the group to check on the situation while they climbed the hill. When the rest of the party finally caught up to him, they found a stunned elf staring into the distance from the top, and for a good reason, as they soon found out. Around the fortress by the base of the hill was a sea of knee-high green critters that numbered in the thousands. The usual number of goblins a single tribe had rarely went over 30 as far as Gilbert knew, so calling this a gathering was a vast understatement. Please, check the ground for holy turnips before you step on it, he uttered, and re-evaluated the harmlessness of the critters. Chapter 17. The literal sea of green little critters was definitely a sight to behold. It vastly exceeded anything the party's more experienced members had even dared to expect. Typically, the goblin tribes were quick to turn to war with one another, or find some other way to limit their population. The constant choir of screeches and other goblinoid noises were almost deafening when the adventurers warily approached the edge of the horde. Anastasia didn't know much about goblins, as they were scarcely mentioned by necromancers for some reason, but she was definitely intrigued by their little dances and flailing. Gilbert had some experience with the critters and took it upon himself to make the first contact with the nearest group of goblins by the edge of the swarm. Seeing him approach, one of them ceased its flailing and greeted the old adventurer. "Man of huge, come meet God," it asked, and pointed towards the fortress. "Sure," Gilbert quickly agreed. "Is that why you've gathered here?" "The goblin come meet sleeping God," the critter explained, surprisingly coherently for its kind. The old adventurer sought answers from the devotee in their party with a quizzical glance, as Emilia likely had the most expansive and up-to-date knowledge on deities out of the adventurers. However, the shrug on her part suggested that the sleeping god wasn't one she knew offhand. Trying to extract further information from the critter proved extremely tedious. Its answers either made no sense at all, or were far too simple to be of any real use, that is, assuming the goblin itself even really knew what was going on. Though it likely was incapable of coming up with lies, there was only so much weight one could give to the words of one of its kind. After all, the world rarely worked like goblins thought it did. After a good while of trying to decipher and formulate a story, Gilbert figured he had more or less gotten the rough gist of it. Here's what I think might have happened. A hunting party from one of the tribes nearby wandered a bit too close to the fort, managed to somehow avoid the traps, and even found a way inside. In there, they found something or someone they decided was the sleeping god of theirs. From there, the tale spread among the tribes like wildfire, and they all slowly ended up here, too preoccupied with their god to turn against each other or end themselves in some other way. He explained to his party. Such typical goblin nonsense. Sommelier scoffed. Their god is probably nothing more than a shiny rock or a stick with a bug on it, and these pests just flock to it like the morons they are. Hold your tongue, Zambi. Maximilian quieted the brigand's critique. Flaunt the possibility of a grounded deity to humans, elves, dwarves, what have you, and they will gather in a very similar manner. Whatever. Now we know why they're here and can leave this goblinoid varmint nightmare. Amelia exclaimed and immediately started walking back towards the direction they came from. Don't be hasty now, Gilbert said and grabbed the Spriggan's shoulder as she was trying to leave. We should see if we can figure out what their god actually is. It could be a deactivated simulacrum or something worse, and I don't think I need to tell you why we should make sure the goblins aren't accidentally going to reactivate this whole fort. Not to mention we need to start making a camp as well. Turning around now would make for an inopportune campsite for the night. After Anastasia managed to convince the party's nature spirit to stay, if for nothing else, to protect the necromancer from the green menace, they made their camp a bit further away from the horde, to make sure their gear remained in their own possession. Some of the more curious goblins approached the camp to ask questions of their own, but the relations between the groups remained civil. Maximilian even managed to barter a deal with a few goblins, for an exchange of 2 pheasants the critters had caught in return for a copper ring with an enchantment that had faded ages ago, and was trivial to replace. To make themselves useful while the rest of the party guarded their gear and cooked, Anastasia and Amelia decided that they would make a quick incursion closer to the fort itself. Perhaps to find out where the goblins had gotten into it. Gilbert saw no harm in it, but warned them about the ancient traps that were likely littering the ground around the fortress. Luckily the ones that were still functional were no doubt easy to spot, thanks to the piles of goblins that had failed to learn from one another, and had fallen victim to them. On their way towards the fortress, the pair passed through the sea of goblins, and got a prime chance to enjoy what passed as culture for the critters. The first thing they noticed was the stench of rotting food emanating from the piles of scavenged odds and ends the goblins had piled everywhere. Stolen tools, vegetables, tree branches, rusted equipment, flowers, rocks and everything else they had run across in their journey to the gathering. The goblins jumped and danced around these random assortments of mostly trash, just as they jumped and danced around anything else in the area, including the adventurers, broken pieces of the machine fortress, and unfortunately for many of them, around the piles of their dead brethren that had died from the traps they had managed to activate, or just from general incompetence of life. The noise they caused was nothing short of deafening, as screeching seemed to be both the default reaction to basically anything, as well as the main method of communication between them. While observing a few of them in more detail, Anastasia found out that the goblins seemed to be unable to remember how to do more than a single thing at once. Whenever one started to dance, it had to relearn how to walk normally a moment later. Waving around a piece of moldy bread caused the same issue, as did simply standing still for more than a few seconds. Despite the smell, noise and just complete inaptitude at everything, the necromancer rather enjoyed watching the little critters go about their life, and chatted with a fair few of them on the way. Do you think we could barter for some of the things they have? Some of it might be valuable, Anastasia suggested and pointed at a fairly intricate-looking sword in one of the piles. Amelia looked around, marveling at the sheer number of the damn things they were surrounded by. Honestly, I wouldn't. From what I understand, anything here could be holy to them by now, and I wouldn't risk insulting them by asking for a trade. Thinking about the devotee's answer, Anastasia started to notice an alarming number of dangerous items the little critters were waving around. Yeah, you're probably right, she agreed. The fortress itself consisted of a larger main building that was surrounded by 5 smaller, almost tower-like buildings. The ground around them had been replaced with large stone tiles, with curious patterns carved on their surfaces, and several brass-colored metal patches, many of which seemed to activate the traps near them. All of them had seen better days, and the eons they had stood out in the elements was visible in the cracks and overgrown plants in the seams between the stone blocks used to build them. Rusted spikes and blades jutted out from the ground here and there in places where the traps had gotten stuck long ago, and chunks of stone that had fallen off the buildings littered their surroundings. The adventurers walked around the main building once, looking for anything that could have been an entrance. The architecture of the ancient fortress was completely different from anywhere else in the world, and finding a purpose for any given part was difficult. The monolithic structure only had straight walls with no windows or details of any kind, no obvious doorframes or even signs of moving parts, only flat, smooth stone and evidence of old age. Anastasia ran her hand along the weathered stone wall as they walked by it, more out of boredom than anything, but luckily, it was the right move. The tips of her fingers felt something strange as they walked past a part of the wall that looked no different to any other part, but the seam between two large slabs of stone was uneven. This hadn't been the case for any other seam, and despite thousands of years of wear and tear, everything had been perfectly in place. She stopped and ran her fingers across the seam again. "There's something weird about this one." "Oh," the devotee said, and immediately whacked the wall with her mace, causing a small flash of light, but the weapon simply bounced off the stone like it was nothing, barely leaving a mark behind. "Did you just try and throw your god at this?" Anastasia chortled. "It was worth the try. Not much is beyond my lady's reach, but her powers are spent elsewhere for the time being." The devotee shrugged and started looking around. "Maybe there's a mechanism somewhere nearby. I'm going to take a look." While she looked for some type of a mechanism or even a keyhole of sorts in the ground tiles around the seam, Anastasia inspected the wall itself. She took one of her daggers and poked its tip into the seam a few times, concluding that the further down she moved, the more uneven and wide the seam became. At the very bottom, only a couple of centimeters from the ground, the tip of the dagger hit something at the back of the small opening. The necromancer wiggled the knife to see if it did anything, which it very much did. With a mechanical thunk and a whir, the stone tile under Anastasia's feet gave out and tilted open, sliding the unprepared girl into a dark hole below the fortress. Emilia heard the noise and managed to lunge at her friend, but was just out of reach, and had to watch the trapdoor close before her. To her credit, she didn't hesitate for a second before jumping into action. The knife she carried was far too thin and fragile to repeat what Anastasia had done to open the trapdoor, so she started to look for anything sharp. A rusty old dagger, haphazardly wielded by a nearby goblin, caught her eye, and the devotee rushed to grab it, but only a couple of steps later, the tile under her foot made an ominous click. Suddenly, a large blade swung at her from the thin gap between the tiles, and before she even realized what had happened, she had caught the ancient corroded blade with her armored gauntlet and the shaft of her mace. The thin piece of worn-down metal snapped off from whatever mechanism that put it into motion, and Emilia could toss it aside to catch her breath, after very narrowly avoiding being sliced into two. However, something was different. After a moment of clearing her thoughts, the devotee realized that the entire goblin horde had gone dead silent, and was now staring at her without a single blink to be found among them. "Woman of white iron, deny sleeping god's judgment," one of the critters screamed from the top of its lungs. Soon the scream turned into a chant the entire mass of goblins took part in. They screeched and grabbed whatever they could before charging at Emilia, who had seen things go south, and was already booking it towards their camp. "Judge! Judge! Judge!" echoed from behind her. Gilbert poked the campfire with a log, trying to expose the embers more to hasten the cooking. He was proud of how well the pheasants were prepared, and couldn't wait for them to be ready. While waiting, he gazed towards the hill between them and the fortress, thinking that it was nice to have such an easy quest for once. No fighting huge creatures or running through swamps. He spotted Emilia running over the peak, waving her hands and screaming something. About 10 seconds after Emilia, a flood of goblins poured over the hill, screeching and throwing rocks or whatever they had on them. "Everyone, to the river," Gilbert ordered the party as the devotee dashed past them. Chapter 18. After tumbling down the trapdoor, Anastasia fell a couple of meters onto a sloped and slippery stone surface in a fairly tight, unlit tunnel. Once the trapdoor sealed itself, the tunnel became pitch black. In the darkness, despite her best efforts to stay upright, she quickly found herself on her back, slow sliding down towards who knows what. Though the journey down was comfortable, the possibility of a larger fall or something even worse started to creep into the necromancer's mind. Kicking and clawing at the walls did nothing to even slow her down, and she simply had to accept her fate, which came in the form of a safe but uncomfortable fall, resulting in nothing but a scraped knee and a strange feeling of disappointment. The room she had landed in was just as dark as the slope. There was no noticeable echo, so it couldn't have been terribly big either. Anastasia figured that if the ones who had built the fortress wanted her dead, she would be dead by now, and started feeling the wall behind her without much care. About half a meter above her head, she could feel the edge of the slope she fell from. But even if she did have the strength to pull herself up, there's no way she could have gotten a proper grip for climbing back up. Below the slope, she could feel a groove, about the width of her thumb and a centimeter deep. Compared to the stone around it, the bottom of the groove felt smooth, almost like glass. Anastasia slid her index finger downwards along it. Roughly at her shoulder height, there was a hole, just big enough for a single finger. After some deliberation, Anastasia pushed in her right pinky, thinking that out of her fingers, she'd missed that one the least. Even though her glove, she could feel the sharp needle stab into her fingertip. As her reflexes kicked in and pulled her finger out, a blue light started to shine along the groove above it. The glow quickly spread along the walls, floor and ceiling, forming complicated and precise patterns on every surface. "Damn it!" she exclaimed and took her glove off to see the tiny red point the needle had made. Weren't these guys supposed to be good at this stuff, and somehow they can't figure out a damn lever for their dumb lighting despite being thin? The needle had gone deep inside her fingertip. Anastasia swore it touched a bone. "I'm probably just poisoned now too, or have some kind of ancient disease or something. Thanks in advance for the lockjaw, you ancient assets." Now that the room was lit, she could see something that looked like a door on the other side. Upon closer inspection, it had a similar little hole in it. "Are you kidding me? Just invent keys." The necromancer groaned and started going through her pockets and belt pouches. With a victorious grin, she dug out a small dried sausage and shoved it into the hole. After far too many increasingly desperate attempts with the sausage, Anastasia gave up and pushed her left pinky in. The spike was almost twice as painful now that she knew it was there, but just like she had expected, the door-like stone slab slid down into the floor. "If this continues, I will find you, bring you back alive, and then kill your stupid dead faces again. I can do that, you know. Technically." As Anastasia cursed the ancient civilization, the opening door revealed a staircase that headed further down under the ground. She made a very vocal complaint about it not being the direction she wanted to head into. Unsurprisingly, the complaints did nothing, and Anastasia was forced to head down the stairs. The light patterns continued on the walls, making the otherwise plain tunnel slightly more interesting. Intrigued by the purpose of the lights, Anastasia spent a while studying them, the direction the pulsating light flowed into, the patterns themselves, and the way they were arranged on the stairs. Suddenly, she started to hear a strange noise coming from deeper down. Listening more closely, it sounded awfully goblin-y, with a delightful mix of screeching, and some of the worst singing the necromancer had ever witnessed. After going down 100 or so more steps, she could finally see the end of the staircase. The noise the goblins made was almost as bad as above ground, and the reason for it became clear to Anastasia. The critters hadn't simply lost a couple of their fellow goblins into the fort, there were at least 100 of them in the hall the stairs led to. All of them facing a throne on the opposite side of the room, so none noticed Anastasia entering. The underground chamber was as big as some of the halls in the castles back at Morn Valley, but the fact that it seemed to be dug into the solid bedrock made it far more impressive. It was well lit by the light patterns flowing along the floor and the columns placed around the room. The throne that the goblins were so focused on was occupied by a fancily dressed skeleton, wearing a long golden coat, a silver plate armor and a massive golden crown that resembled a dead tree with jewels and pearls fit into its trunk. Yet the most curious thing about the remains were their size. Though it was a bit hard to estimate the exact height of this ancient ruler, they must have been closer to 3 meters tall. As Anastasia started to walk closer to get a better look, the goblins noticed her. "Girl of underground, live here. She knows sleeping god?" one of the goblins inquired. "What? I don't," the necromancer was about to say, but realized that the truth may have been the best thing to reveal at the moment. "I mean, yeah, we're the bestest of buddies. We've been inseparable for ages." The goblin seemed impressed by Anastasia's relation to their new god. "Girl of underground live here? Not up?" it asked and pointed towards the ceiling. "Yes. I too have slept for ages but was woken up by you." Anastasia lied and pretended to yawn. The goblins seemed ecstatic hearing that they had found another god. They opened up a path towards the throne and allowed Anastasia to walk up to the skeleton. She wasn't about to touch the ancient remains, but wiped off the thick layer of dust from one of the throne's armrests and sat on it. On the skeleton's lap, there was a leather and metal-bound book that seemed important. As Anastasia grabbed it, the slight movement was enough to cause the skeleton's skull and heavy crown to drop down and roll onto the floor. "Oh crap." The necromancer cursed and started to worry about the ruler's new followers turning on her. She remembered the holy turnip and was prepared to face the wrath of the goblins, but they just stood still. After a couple of silent moments, a shriek came from somewhere in the crowd. Girl of underground defeat sleeping god. Girl of underground more powerful god. One of them screamed. Ah yes. I am your god now. Anastasia played along. The smaller horde of goblins began to dance and scream like they did around the fortress. Finding a new god seemed like a cause for great celebration for them. Anastasia noticed another door in the corner of the hall, with another small hole in it. After looking at her pinkies for a second, she realized that she was a god now, and didn't have to be the one potentially poisoning herself with stupid ancient mechanisms. You, goblin. Come here and put your finger into this hole. She ordered one of her new subjects. The goblin tried to do as she asked, but couldn't quite reach the hole, so Anastasia ordered another goblin to lift them up. The door opened to a small room with a stone altar in the middle of it. On the altar, there was a platter on it, filled with various kinds of jewels and other trinkets. Seeing an opportunity for some additional rewards for the quest, Anastasia rushed over and shoved as many as she could into her pouches. While she was busy being greedy, a goblin dragged the skeleton's crown to her. God of Underground wear big hat. Something about the critter's tone made it clear that this wasn't a question or a request. Anastasia hesitantly put the crown on after making sure it didn't have any of its previous owner stuck on it. The crown was a bit loose on her, but nowhere near as heavy as she thought it would be. As she looked around for a reflective surface, the newly crowned god noticed a staircase in the corner of the hall, slightly hidden by a column, a staircase which led up. Everyone had made it across the river in one piece, and the goblins didn't dare to even dip their feet into the water. Instead, they flung rocks and sticks at the outsiders they now deemed heretics. Gilbert grabbed Amelia by the shoulders. What happened and where is Anna? He asked, clearly more worried than angry. We were looking for a possible door into the fort, and Anna somehow managed to find one, but it closed before I was able to catch her. I couldn't open it again and maybe did something that angered them. I really don't know. The devotee explained. Gilbert quickly made sure his other party member was fine, and started planning for their next move. Anna can probably manage for now, she's armed and not the type to die easily. What we need to worry about is getting to the fort without being torn apart here isn't. It took an hour to come up with a plan that would involve lighting Dammer briefly on fire, and throwing him across the river, and having Zamiliere grow a fake party out of some trees, among other questionable tactics. Weirdly, Dammer was the one who was most willing to go for it. Suddenly Maximilian asked everyone to be quiet for a moment. Gilbert, I think the goblins are saying that the god is coming. Should we run or fight? He asked after listening to the muddled chanting from the other side of the river. Let's meet this god, maybe they can be reasoned with. The old adventurer decided. Or maybe it's a turnip, added the Spriggan. The party prepared for a fight as they walked back closer to the river, but quickly realized their worries to be wholly unfounded, as they saw the supposed god prancing among the small critters. I am the god of underground, the necromancer, queen of goblins and destroyer of the sleeping god. Submit to me and your sins shall be undone. Anastasia declared from the other side of the river, and almost died of laughter, as her party was forced to bow down to her. Chapter 19. Now the uncontested ruler of a herd of goblins, Anastasia used her power over them to have the critters gather materials they could use for a simple raft, that would allow the party to use the steady flow of the river to avoid walking. Pretty much everyone outside of the necromancer carried a length of rope with them, so the main ingredient for a raft they were missing were logs. Luckily enough, the forest they had passed had plenty. Though the goblins were far too small for lumberjacks, an endless supply of them allowed for results in due time. Casualties piled up as they chipped away at the trunks with what tools they had, and moved the already felled ones to the river, but their god's orders were absolute, and the deaths of many of their kind beyond irrelevant to the rest. Well, she couldn't deny the effectiveness of the method, and she didn't have a long-term plan for her followers. Anastasia wasn't fond of the steep cost. In fact, she would have probably rather walked had she known beforehand. After learning what the necromancer could tell them, the party decided their quest to be completed, and would embark as swiftly as possible. So, while the rest of the party assembled the raft, Emilia and Dammer handled the cooking, salvaging what was left of the pheasants and the rations they had with them for the journey. Returning to the fort for an attempt at a re-entry was deemed too risky because of the quickly changing allegiance of the goblins, and they would simply explain the situation as they understood it when they returned to Valor. While watching the campfire they were cooking on, Dammer noticed Anastasia watching over her followers closely and allowing a group of them to follow her everywhere. "Fond of your underlings, lass?" he asked. "They're all right. I'd like to teach them about self-preservation," the necromancer commented a bit lamentingly. Don't forget that you need to get rid of them somehow. Can't have them follow us all the way to Valor," the dwarf pointed out as gently as he could. Anastasia nodded. She was planning on leaving the crown behind and telling the goblins that the sleeping god would look after them in her absence. She had no idea if that would work though, since she basically decapitated their previous god. "We'll figure something out," Dammer assured her. Anastasia remembered the book she had found in the fort, dug it from her backpack, and showed it to the dwarf. "Any idea what's this about?" "There's nothing written on the cover or on the pages, so I figured it's just an empty journal or something." Dammer took the book and inspected it. The covers were made from something resembling leather in texture, but a keen observer could tell it wasn't. The corners were covered in metallic plates that seemed like brass, probably to reduce wear. Dammer started flipping through the pages. Aside from a half circle on the edge of each page, they were all empty. "There's probably something more to this, but I'm afraid your book is beyond me," he admitted and handed the book back. "Maybe show it to the scholar when we get our reward." "Think you'll pay for it?" Anastasia wondered. The dwarf laughed and returned to cooking. "They always do, girlie. They always do." Both the raft and the party's meal were finished almost simultaneously. So, with their transport secured and only a quick shove away from being in the river, they sat down to eat. Gilbert's disappointment over the rather charred state of the pheasants he had been forced to abandon on the fire earlier was visible, and Anastasia thought she actually saw a tear roll down his cheek as he scraped the black crust off the meat. Offering her condolences, the necromancer sat down next to him and started eating her portion. As she nibbled on the bird, the oversized crown wobbled uncomfortably on her head, and she decided to take it off for the time being. As soon as the crown was placed on a rock by Anastasia's seat, all of the goblins tumbling and hopping around them stopped and turned towards their god. "The god rock has big hat. Girl of underground, a false god," one of them screeched, and like before, the scream spread like wildfire among the critters. Slowly, Anastasia took the crown again and put it on her head, hoping to defuse the situation. "False god stole big hat. Kill." Another goblin screamed and caused the horde to turn on their previous god, even if that was exactly how she had become a god to them in the first place. The thoroughly confused necromancer threw the crown at the goblin, inciting the rest. The party once more had to grab what they could and retreat to the river. On the way, Gilbert took charge of the situation. "Familiar. Anna, hold them back while we push the rafts into the river," he commanded. The Spriggan had been waiting for an excuse to attack the critters she hated, and proceeded to stomp the ground before them. In seconds, thorny vines grew between her and the mass of goblins. Nearby trees sprang their roots from the ground, springing goblins high into the air. It seemed to work well, but a few stragglers managed to climb over the vines, while they were busy strangling other goblins. Anastasia quickly dispatched them with her daggers, moving them in the air from goblin to goblin, striking them in the head or cutting it clean off. The number of these stragglers increased steadily, and soon the two were forced to back down towards the river. Every now and then, Anastasia stopped to throw a dagger at a goblin, and then explode the corpse into sharp shards of bone, taking out any nearby goblins and slowing them down slightly. A few of the trees they passed also fell over on top of their pursuers as a last resort. When the pair had retreated far enough for the river to be in sight, the others had just pushed the raft off the bank and jumped on it. To buy just a few more seconds, Anastasia stopped to concentrate on her surroundings. There were about 120 corpses within 50 meters of them, and the number increased quickly as vines and roots snapped goblins in half. Pointing the palms of her hands towards the goblins, she told Familiar to run and jump on the raft, to which the Spriggan hesitantly agreed. While concentrating, the necromancer closed one of her hands into a fist and pointed the other towards the sky. Suddenly every corpse within her range exploded at once, and the sharp shards of bone flew high up into the air, creating a cloud of red mist that was blown towards her by the wind. With her eyes almost closed, Anastasia turned towards the rafts and ran as fast as she could. Barely making it onto the raft with something that can only be called a tumble, she got to safety and was dragged away from the edge by Zamiliere, while the others used long branches to push the raft away from the bank. What even just happened? Emilia asked and kneeled next to Anastasia to see that she was still in one piece. Furiously wiping the tiny droplets of blood off her face, the necromancer could only barely talk. I'll explain later, but I would like to pass out now. Could you please make sure I don't have any goblin bits in my hair? She said and went limp from the thought of it alone. The adrenaline rush had made it possible for her to resist the urge to throw up or pass out while seeing so many bursting goblins, but as she calmed down, it became overwhelming. The goblins began to reach the river and threw anything they could at the party, even bits of other goblins wherever they happened to be at hand. This came to an end as the shards of bone began to fall down on them as a hail of razors, cutting them down by the hundreds. The lucky ones that didn't get hit as badly scattered and gave up on following the rafts along the river. The party just watched at the absurd carnage in silence, while the rafts drifted further away. Maximilian looked at the unconscious necromancer that was lying on Zamiliere's lap. It was probably better that she wasn't here for this, even I feel kind of bad after having seen that. But I must say, the girl is effective if nothing else, he admitted. Anastasia woke up to cold water being sprinkled on her face by Zamiliere. Time to wake up. The Spriggan smiled with her face uncomfortably close to the necromancer's. They had already drifted for quite a while and were once more in the middle of the forest, far away from the fort and its goblins. Anastasia looked around and was relieved to see everyone in good health and high spirits after a successful escape. While she had been out, a slight problem had surfaced with their raft, in that it only barely supported the entire party, which meant that they weren't getting out of it dry, as water seeped up from between the logs. The others had graciously made sure that Anastasia's gear, and more importantly, the things she had found in the fort, weren't in danger of getting wet. In return, the necromancer did the right thing and divided the jewels and trinkets she had looted between the members of the party. It was agreed that she should hold on to the book and keep whatever she managed to get for it, as the reward for the quest was plentiful on its own, and the jewels would make sure everyone ended up well in the green. Chapter 20. Though moist, the party's return to Valor on their raft was safe, smooth and comparably fast. Upon their return, it was decided that Gilbert and Anastasia would handle the exchange with the person who had given the quest to the guild, while the rest of the party headed to the inn for a rest. The directions on the quest notice led the pair to another inn, a bit further inside the city than the one they lived in. The building itself was slightly larger than Rosie's inn, but according to Gilbert, had less than half as many rooms. Its immaculate outer appearance imitated the architecture of the nearby guild office, and the establishment was obviously aimed to a higher class clientele than the bunch of ragtag drunkards Anastasia was living with. The stark difference in the sheer amount of class between the inns couldn't have been more apparent the second the pair stepped into the entrance hall. Instead of the homely wooden interior, the scent of delicious food and pipe tobacco, they were met with a sterile, marble-encrusted hall that had an echo of a much larger room. Instead of several tables for groups of adventurers to enjoy their time off together, there were expensive decorations ranging from paintings to frankly ugly vases. Behind a polished granite counter sat the sole employee responsible for reservations, an older female elf with a flawless red velvet uniform and an uptight aura. She took one glance at the adventurers and clearly judged them harshly. "Can I help you? You do not look like our typical clientele. Are you perhaps lost?" she asked and tried very hard to not sound extremely rude. Gilbert handed over the quest notice. "We're here to see a scholar by the name of Mikhail Gren. We've completed a quest for him," he explained. "Oh, that certainly makes more sense." The elf sighed in relief. "Master Gren has informed us that he was expecting adventures. Please follow me to his quarters." The elf's gait was elegant yet stern as she walked upstairs to the third floor. It was clear from the unnaturally quick pace that she didn't want rowdy adventurers like Gilbert and Anastasia standing around in her establishment. Anastasia tugged Gilbert's sleeve. Why do so many elves have sticks so far up their asses? She whispered. It comes with the age. When you live for 300 years, everyone under 80 seems like a dumb child to you. They're not bad people, just from a different generation. The old adventurer explained and chuckled at the observation. Anastasia accepted the answer and decided to not hold it against the clerk, though she was reminded of another elf. Even the guy who owns a clothes shop on the main road, near the guild office. Gilbert clearly knew the elf in question. No, that guy is younger than me and a complete asshole. Rosie almost choked him out once because he refused to make adjustments for some tunic she had bought. Rosie's great, the necromancer said, remembering wanting to do the same herself. They arrived at a door near the end of the corridor. The elf knocked on it. Master Gren, there are some adventurers here. They wish to talk to you about a quest. After what sounded like a rather laborious journey for the room's resident, T0 door opened. Behind it was an ancient-looking dark elf. His red eyes were slightly cloudy and dark skin full of wrinkles and spots. Have you completed it? Did you visit the fortress? The scholar asked. Gilbert nodded. Aye. We've been there. Mikhail smiled excitedly and turned to the innkeeper. Miss, could you be so kind as to get us some coffee? The elf nodded and hurried off. The dark elf gestured for the adventurers to come in, and journeyed back to a comfortable-looking armchair that was surrounded by books and scrolls. The room itself was about 3 times the size of Anastasia's room, and all the furniture were beautifully crafted and decorated, as opposed to the cheap but sturdy ones in her room. I am Mikhail Gren, one of the leading experts on machine fortresses and the simulacra. I assume you found out what made those creatures gather around the fortress. The scholar inquired, still full of excitement. The goblins found a way in and started worshipping something they found inside. Anastasia here also found a way in and can tell you the details. The old adventurer explained briefly and pushed the necromancer forwards. Mikhail's eyes widened after hearing that Anastasia had been inside. Is this true? You were inside the fortress, Anastasia, was it? You must tell me every last detail. There are only a handful of people who have ever been inside an inactive machine fortress. He demanded and scrambled for a quill and paper to take notes. As Anastasia explained what had happened, the old scholar could barely stay still. He quickly pushed aside everything he had on the table next to the armchair, and began taking notes. He was especially interested in the skeleton that the goblins had called the Sleeping God, and sketched its armor and crown based on Anastasia's description. Oh, and I also found this. The necromancer remembered, took out the book and showed it to the scholar, who gasped for air and slowly accepted the book with shaking hands. You found this inside? He gasped. Anastasia shrugged. Yeah, the dead guy was holding it. It's empty, but I was told to let you check it out. Mikhail opened up the first spread and inspected it thoroughly. He slid his fingers along the edges of the page and smiled excitedly. My girl, this book is far from empty. He muttered and placed his thumbs on the half circles on the edges of the page. Suddenly blue light patterns appeared all over the pages, forming characters Anastasia had never seen before. Roughly translated, this book is called The End of Orun. I think it tells what happened to the people who build the machine fortresses. Oh, cool. Wanna buy it? Anastasia asked, not really understanding how impressed she should be. The scholar's jaw dropped. He looked like he couldn't quite grasp what was happening. You want to sell it? Do you not know how much this is worth? There are in total 7 other functional books written by the Orun in the whole world. I don't have much spare money on me. I can't do much with it, and you seem like a decent enough guy, so it'd be a shame if you didn't buy it. Anastasia was using what meager skills as a merchant she had just to see what the old man would offer. She didn't particularly care for the book, and genuinely found Mikhail pleasant to talk to and his enthusiasm refreshing. I know. Give me 10 days and I'll send you twice the quest reward in gold, a royal blessing from my country, and a set of enchanted items. The ancient dark elf tried frantically to come up with anything the girl might be interested in. Deal. The necromancer accepted without haggling. She had no idea what a royal blessing was, but it sounded interesting enough. Mikhail looked like someone had just given him the world and more, and making someone that happy was a reward in itself. Gilbert looked doubtful about the whole thing. Which country would that be? And how does an old man like you have enough pull to get a royal blessing? I guess my introduction was kind of incomplete. The Orin are just my hobby. My vocation is being the mentor and advisor of the great king of Vassand, Mikhail said without taking his eyes off the book. Gilbert knew Vassand to be an extremely powerful nation neighboring Morn Valley to the north. It was one of the 3 biggest countries on the continent, and had easily the largest military presence as well as strong alliances. They weren't generally considered an enemy by Valor, but had in a couple of cases intervened on guild business when quests had taken place in their land. While the scholar was busy drooling over the book he had acquired, Anastasia whispered to Gilbert, "What's a royal blessing? You accepted without knowing that." A royal blessing is a boon used by some kingdoms that basically lets you wish for almost anything, and the country will do all it can to make it happen. A blessing from a country as big as Vassand means you can probably take over a small nation if you want to, Gilbert explained, clearly seeing the trade worthwhile now. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. "I brought the coffee like you asked, Master Gren," the innkeeper said, placed a tray on the table near the door, and served everyone a cup before leaving to her duties. The cups were made from some expensive-looking ceramics and felt fragile. Gilbert broke the handle on his cup immediately, but Mikhail told him not to worry about it. "I can just say that I dropped it, since my hands aren't what they used to be. I owe you and your girl that much." The dark elf laughed. "That reminds me, I believe I was supposed to pay you for completing the quest too, since I didn't leave the money with the guild." He took out a bag full of coins from a chest next to his bed, and handed it to Anastasia. "I hope your travels bring you to Vassand before this old body of mine gives up. You'll always be welcome to the capital as my guest," the scholar said warmly with a wide and genuine smile on his face. After finishing their drinks and telling the scholar where to send the payment for the book, the pair left for the guild office to register the quest as complete. On the way there, Anastasia remembered that she didn't ask what kind of enchantment the items would hold.